Hey guys, let's understand the concept of clustering depth and overlapping. Now, for this sake, I have taken an example from the official documentation of Snowflake, and the concept is pretty simple. Let's focus on the first layer. The first layer, let's say this is this block, and these two numbers is all you have to focus on initially. Now, imagine a table which is clustered using a cluster key, okay? And this key or this column has values in the range of A to Z, okay? Now, initially, when you create the table and you ingest a new batch of data, you populate the table with some rows, all right? Snowflake creates 5 partitions. And the 5 partitions are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, okay? Now, each of these partitions for the clustering key have the values in the range of A to Z. Okay, the first micropartition has values for the clustered key or clustering key in the range of A to Z. The second one also has the same range. It has all of the values in the range of A to Z, so on and so forth. So all the 5 partitions have values ranging from A to Z. I don't mean to say it has the exact same data. Of course not. The combination is different. But the range resides in each of these micropartitions. In that case, you say it's 100% overlap. As you can see, these micropartitions fully overlap in the range of values that they have. So the number of overlapping micropartitions is 5, and the overlapping depth is 5 again, because your overlapping depth is the measure of micropartitions, okay, and how well your table is clustered. So the overlapping depth is 5. Now you ingest more data. Let's say a new batch of data comes in and you recluster the table. Let's say that auto clustering is turned on and the table is clustered again. Now when this table gets clustered, it ends up creating 2 micropartitions, with one with a range of values from A to D, and the second one with a range of values from E to J. All right. Now, if you remember the definition of constant partitions from the previous video, it creates 2 partitions which become constant. Okay, so there's no overlap here. These 2 partitions have nothing in common with the other micropartitions. But you see the other 3 partitions which have values in the range of K to Z, they have some overlap. So 3 micropartitions overlap fully, hence overlapping micropartition count is 3, and the overlapping depth is 3 again. Okay. Now again, let's say new batch of data comes in, the table gets reclustered automatically. Now what it does is these 2 constants remain the same, A to D and E to J. So the number of constant micropartition is still 2. But you see the other 3 micropartitions have slight overlap. The first one, which has values in the range of Q to Z, overlaps, let's say 30%, 40%, with the other one, which has values in the range of L to S. Similarly, the micropartition which has L to S overlaps with the one which has K to N. So 3 micropartitions overlap, and hence the count is 3. Now the overlapping depth is 2, because if you see these 3, the 3 micropartitions do not fully overlap with each other. Let's say this one overlaps 50% and the other one is 50%. Okay, and you sum it up, it becomes 2. So the total count of micropartitions which are overlapping in general is 3, but the depth is 2 because they don't fully overlap. Now the table gets reclustered again, and it ends up creating 5 constant micropartitions. All right, there is no overlap at all. Hence, the overlapping micropartition count is 0, but the depth is 1. This is the minimum count. When it comes to overlapping depth, it cannot be below 1. Now the last one is the most ideal scenario. To be honest, it never happens in a real world use case. So that's how you understand the meaning of overlapping micropartitions and overlapping depth. Now a table with no micropartition has a depth of 0. Okay, this only happens if the table is empty. As we've seen, if a table is populated with data, Snowflake will create micropartitions out of it. So an empty table has a depth of 0. When it comes to average depth, we've seen what depth is, right? Now an average overlapping depth is the average number of depths of each micropartition in the table. Simple. Smaller the average depth, better clustered the table is. Now this value, as I mentioned earlier, is always 1 or greater. Now if you have a huge table, let's say, with an average depth of 65, you just know it's not well clustered. If you have a table with an average depth of 1.2, it's pretty decently clustered. When it comes to average overlaps, it's the average number of overlapping micropartitions for each micropartition in the table. A high number indicates the table is not well clustered. If you have an average overlap of 120, you know it's not well clustered. But if you have an average overlap of 4.5, you know it's well clustered. Now, again, these numbers, high number, low number, these are very absolutely relative to the size of the table. Okay. Now, an average depth of 10 could mean high for a table which has small amounts of data, a few GBs. But the same 10 could be a decent amount, a decent number for a table with terabytes of data. So just keep that in mind. Finally, you have something called partition depth histogram. This is basically a histogram which depicts the distribution of overlap depth for each micropartition in the table. This partition depth histogram is better understood practically. So let's go back to our Snowflake account. Let's execute the same function, which is clustering information, and let's have a look at the line item, which we've seen earlier. I'm just going to bring it up. So we've already seen the first 3 values. This table is clustered using the key ship date. It has 9556 partitions, out of which 7367 are constant micropartitions, an average overlap of 0.4, which is very good, and an average depth of 1.2. Now, the minimum value, as we know, when it comes to average depth is 1. So if your table has an average depth of 1.2, which means it's pretty well clustered. Now let's scroll down. Partition depth histogram. Now this is a key value pair. It's basically a histogram of keys and values where keys tells you the average depth. Okay. So if you look at the first one, let's look at the first key. It is 0. This is basically saying a depth of 0. Okay. You have 0 micropartitions with an average depth of 0. Okay. That is very obvious. You have 7,300 micropartitions with an average depth of 1. And you have 2,206 micropartitions with an average depth of 2. So on and so forth. Now, in this histogram, for this table specifically, which is line item, you only see 3 keys which have values. So if you add them up, 7,300 plus 2,206 and 50, it will add up to the total number of micropartitions that you have, which is 9,556. Okay. Now, the way to interpret this is if you see values at the higher end, which means lower average depth, just know that your table is well partitioned. But if you see more values, more number of micropartitions towards the end, let's say you had 500 or 5,000 micropartitions, which had an average depth of 15 and a few thousands, which an average depth of 16, which means your table is not well clustered. So always focus on the top end. Okay, so you should know if you see more micropartitions or all of your micropartitions are distributed in the top 3 or 4 values, it means your table is pretty well clustered. So that's how you interpret these values, and that's pretty much it for this video. Next up, we will be looking at the considerations when it comes to choosing your clustering keys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next.